So, hello Matthew.
Hello, sir.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Can you tell me more about your war experience in Ukraine?
In Ukraine, I spent 635 days here previously in Ukraine, and I spent almost all of that time in the International Legion under the Ukraine GUR, the military intelligence here. I believe I'm the only US citizen to have spent that much time here doing combat operations. I'm not talking about expats that were living here previously or people doing humanitarian stuff, but as far as people doing combat operations without leaving the country for a break, I believe I have more days here than any other US citizen.
You spent more than 600 days in Ukraine, you mentioned it, and the last half a year you spent in the US, traveling around and trying to convince American people to help Ukraine more. How many meetings did you have and how it was organized?
So that was something that I honestly can't count all the meetings that I had, because I had meetings with just your average voters and with lawmakers, average citizens just on the street, at a gas station, stuff that was planned and a lot that was not planned. While I was in America for 6 months, I drove over 32,000 kilometers. So I was all over the country, and it's a big country, but 32,000 kilometers covers a lot of ground. And most of that time was me spending interacting and talking about Ukraine. And it wasn't so much to persuade, but it was really just to educate what is going on at the front lines from an American warfighter perspective. And most of the people that I interacted with, both lawmakers and your average citizens, had never talked to an American that had spent time at the front lines, especially an American that had spent almost 2 years doing frontline operations. So that was something that was very impactful, and a lot of it was me just telling them the reality of what's going on. And some of them had no idea what was going on. Some of them are very surprised to hear that the war is still continuing because they thought the war was over, only because they haven't heard it on the news in quite some time. Other people have heard some very negative things, that that NATO started this war and provoking Russia to invade, and Russia's just defending their country and their rights. Other people say that isn't Zelensky taking all this aid money and putting it in his pocket and going on really nice vacations and stuff like that. And I was able to explain to them how aid packages work, because most Americans have no idea. Most Americans do not understand that most aid packages have no cash in them leaving the US. And that, for example, if aid package is $20 billion, most of that is all spent in the United States with American companies, which is hiring more Americans, which provides more taxpayers, which is boosting our economy. And then those companies provide weapons, munitions, whatever the aid package was paying for, to the United States, so that way they can then donate it for a value of $20 billion to the Ukrainian government, so it could be used however that agreement was made. And that's stuff that I know that it's working. We need a lot more of it, but it's working because all the weapons I've had at the front lines have all been brand new American weapons. Stuff that when I was in the US military for 5 years, I never had a brand new weapon, ever. But over here, all the weapons I've been issued by Ukraine that got them from the United States have all been brand new weapons. So the aid packages are working, of American weapons getting in the hands of Americans and Ukrainians and other foreigners that are working here at the front lines. We just need a lot more of it. So I was able to just provide the reality to the American citizens and lawmakers of just what is actually happening, which might be a little bit different than what they're hearing. Or again, like I said, some of them are not hearing anything at all.
When you took on this effort, what were your expectations and what was the reality, in fact, when it's ended up?
My expectation would be that it would be a long and difficult journey, and that I would be doing and expending a lot of energy to have very small success. And I believe that that was kind of the reality. I was able to do a lot of talking, and the talking that I did was very successful, but it was for a very small amount of people, both lawmakers and your average voters. But it's something that I was able to spend time talking to Congress with, partnering with the American Coalition for Ukraine back in April of this year. And that was just a few days before Congress voted on this aid package. And part of what I was expressing to them, along with the rest of the coalition that was there, is how urgent this is. That it's been 6 months, arguing back and forth about this aid package, and that we need the aid package now, absolutely. And that was something that I thought was really awesome to see the success, that just a few days later, the House of Representatives was voting on this aid package, By the weekend, I believe the Senate was voted on the aid package, and by the following week, I believe the aid package was at the White House for the signature by the president. So that's something that I'm very proud to see that little bit of success, that I had some small part of 60 billion worth of aid coming to Ukraine, which helps Ukraine and it helps Europe and it helps the rest of the world.
I saw your previous interview and you mentioned that you are kind of disappointed by the way you were communicating with Americans about the war in Ukraine, because they are not too much interested in this.
Some of them have been told a lot of disinformation and propaganda. That is one thing that we know that Russia is very bad at. Russia is very bad at a lot of things, but one of the things that they are very good at is disinformation and propaganda, and they are pouring a lot of money into this. I found out from a reliable source that they're spending over $2.5 billion in their propaganda, a lot of it targeting the West, whereas America's spending maybe $800 million, according to my source about this. So that's Russia's outspending the United States by over 4 times. So when people say stuff like Russia's just defending themselves, Zelensky's corrupt and he's taking all the money and none of these aid packages are going to the front lines, that I believe is where all that's coming from. Even the separation that is seen in America of Democrats versus Republicans, and how depending on how you vote might destroy your relationship with a friend of yours or a family member, that is something that I believe is coming just from this Russian propaganda and this disinformation. So that was something that I really appreciated, of just being able, for those that were willing to listen, to be able to just tell them just the realities of what's going on. And to tell them that I spent almost 2 years here and I never saw an American Abrams tank disappear due to corruption. I never saw an artillery piece disappear due to corruption. That it's impossible to just put one of those in your pocket and disappear with it to sell it on the black market. So I'm sure that there's some stuff going on that, I know Ukrainian lawmakers are working very hard to fix, but for the most part, these aid packages are working. We just need a lot more of them, and we need them sooner rather than later, so that way we could avoid having a direct confrontation between America and Russia and World War III.
How did you personally react to the fact that many ordinary Americans are not deeply concerned about what is going on in Ukraine?
For me, I fully understand it, and there's pros and cons to having a very secure nation. That I appreciate that so many Americans are not interested in what's going on here because they don't know what air raid sirens sound like, unless they're old enough to be alive during World War II, when we were attacked by the Japanese on the west coast of the United States, and we were attacked by German U-boats on the east coast of the United States back in the 40s. If you weren't alive during that time, or if you did not volunteer to go to some combat zone in some other country, then Americans have no idea what it's like for artillery to come in, enemy
it's like
aircraft.
The war on television.
Correct. And that I'm very proud of, that a lot of Americans have no idea what war is like because the American politicians send the American military to go do amazing things to protect America and keep America safe. Unfortunately, that produces a lot of voters that vote in ways that can be very frustrating. So for stuff like this, some of them feel that this is not America's fight. Some of them told me that Ukraine shares a border with Russia, not the United States. And those are some uneducated individuals that I had to remind them that the US absolutely shares a border with Russia. It's only a few kilometers, and Russia is known for sending nuclear-capable bombers into our airspace. That they do this. Sometimes it's to be funny, and sometimes for other reasons. So that's something that I've had to just remind people, that we do share a border and that the fight does affect us directly. A lot of them also are not aware of the Budapest Memorandum, which I did not know anything about until I got here. Once I got here and I was told about it, I did some research and saw that America, along with others, has a legal obligation to provide security guarantees to the sovereignty of Ukraine. And that was signed under President Bill Clinton in the 90s. And unfortunately, when Russia originally invaded back in 2014, it appears that not a whole lot was done by the West. And now it has escalated to a full-scale invasion, and we're doing almost too little too late, very similar to World War II, when Hitler goes into Poland and no one really did anything. And then Hitler kept on going and he kept on going until it got so bad that then we had to invest hundreds of thousands and millions of American lives, along with lives from all other nations, to fight this problem. And that we're working really hard to fight that problem here, so that way we don't have a repeat of that.
How many Americans have no clue about these facts?
I'd say that it's a very high percentage, which part of it includes myself. That before I got here, I'd never heard of the Budapest Memorandum. Before this full-scale invasion happened in 2022, I honestly never really heard of Ukraine, which is interesting because I know a lot about Chernobyl. I'm very interested in nuclear-related stuff, and I know a lot about Chernobyl, but I had no idea it was in Ukraine until I physically got here and noticed that it's not that far from the capital of Ukraine here in Kyiv. So that's just an example of how most Americans just don't know. I know a lot about Iraq and Afghanistan. I know quite a bit about Russia, and I was taught from a very young age that Russia was America's #1 enemy, and provided evidence along the way. And some of that evidence I was able to get while I was in Afghanistan, talking to Afghani locals that showed me and other Marines some of the evidence of what the Russians did when they invaded during the Cold War, targeting civilians, raping and killing civilians en masse, targeting civilian targets instead of only military targets in Afghanistan. So that was something that I actually, as tragic as that is, I appreciated. To see that it wasn't just my government telling me some information that may or may not be true, but they told me some information, and I was actually able to go to an area where Russia's been and see some evidence from people that have survived the evil that happened there, which is one of the reasons why I came here. Is I have a passion to help and serve others, and I know the evil stuff that Russia's known for doing when they invade a country. Stuff like the atrocities in Bucha. It's tragic, but when it was on the news in the United States, it was of no surprise to me, because I know that that's what Russia's known for doing when they invade a place.
So what was your lifetime and military experience before you ended up in Ukraine?
So I'm a United States Marine. I'm a scout sniper. I was active duty in the US Marine Corps and the American military from 2005 to 2010. I did combat deployments to both Iraq and Afghanistan during that time. After that, I went as a civilian back to Iraq to work for a private company that did security for the US Embassy and the State Department of the United States, primarily at our embassy in Baghdad, which is the largest embassy in the world, and also a little bit of time at our US consulate in Basra, which is down in southern Iraq, until we shut it down. During all that time, I spent over 2,200 days, so over 2,000 days, just in Iraq doing that job over the course of 15 deployments over about 9 years. So that gave me a lot more experience of interacting with those that are supported by Russia, those that are supported by Soviet munitions and weapons. And so when this all happened here, then I was able to use a lot of that experience and that skill set to do a lot of good stuff here and to help out the Ukrainian people here and the Ukrainian military units.
You mentioned that you came here after February 2022. It was the first days of the invasion, yep? I'm correct?
So I came here, I crossed the border May 27. So I missed the first couple months, and I spent those first couple months doing a lot of research. Because like I said, before this happened, before I saw it on the news in February, I honestly never really heard of Ukraine. So I spent some time doing some research. Because back in February, Russia was known as the second strongest military in the world. And that's something I wasn't going to just volunteer to go and fight the second strongest military in the world. It didn't seem smart. So I spent some time, did some research. Luckily, I even found some other Americans that I had worked with previously in Iraq that had been on the front lines here already. So I was able to talk to them directly to actually understand more of the reality here, because I understood initially that it's not going to be the same as Iraq and Afghanistan. This isn't fighting an insurgency here like it is in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's fighting an actual uniformed army that has an air force, that has a navy, that has artillery support and tanks, armored vehicles, stuff like that. So that was something I spent those months preparing just to better understand what I was going to commit myself to before coming over in May.
There was some kind of internal conflict that you did experience during doing all this job and deciding you need to go to Ukraine or not?
It was something that, like I said, I've always had a passion to help and serve others. And I felt that knowing what I know about Russia and that they're known for doing evil, horrible stuff, especially to civilians when they invade a country, that I honestly just felt it was my duty to come over here and do as much as I could. And with the warfare and also seeing President Zelensky's invitation for foreign fighters to come over and join the Legion, I felt that I could just use my skills and experience very well here because I've been doing stuff with body armor and firearms most of my adult life.
Do you remember the moment when the final decision came, or it was like a process for you?
It was a small process. When it first started and I heard the invitation from the president to come over here from any foreign assistance that any foreign fighters are willing to come over here, it was something that it sounds cool. But the logical part of me decided to wait.
But a little bit danger.
Yes, to really look at the risk versus reward for it. And honestly, when it first happened, myself and many other experts, thought that Ukraine would lose in the first few days, maybe a week or two. And I know that multiple embassies evacuated, including the American embassy in Kyiv. They evacuated before this invasion happened because they saw what was going to happen soon. And a lot of people thought that Ukraine would lose very quickly. I was very surprised that this country that I've never really heard of was able to fight off the Russian army, which again, we thought was the second strongest military in the world. So that told me a lot of information that one, Russia's not the second strongest of anything. If they're being fought against and defeated by a country that I've never really heard of. And that gave me a lot of hope for Ukraine and for the defeat of Russia. So that then encouraged me to continue with my research to find out more about the reality of what's going on at the front lines and in Ukraine, just to make sure that I'm not going to come over here just to face a Ukrainian defeat.
So decision is made, and did you have a plan?
I didn't have too much of a plan. From the people that I talked to, they advised me to bring as much supplies and gear as I could, because they told me that once you get to Ukraine, you might only get a rifle. And that might be all that Ukraine can give you, is a rifle and some ammo, and then they send you out to a trench. So I brought as much stuff as I possibly could. I had some stuff left over from my previous days. And I came over. I came over completely by myself. I could not find anyone that would be willing to donate a plane ticket, so I paid for the plane ticket, which was about $1,500 just to get to Warsaw. And then from there, took a train and then a taxi and then walked across the border. Thankfully, once I crossed the border, I was told that there'd be a tent on the Ukrainian side of the border for the International Legion. And before I got to that tent, a random Ukrainian American came up to me, very curious about why I was there, because it was obvious that I did not belong. It was obvious I was a foreigner. I had my military backpack, we call it a rucksack, that I carried also in Iraq and Afghanistan on me. So it was obvious that I had some kind of military background. So this individual helped me out a lot. He helped me get my first burner phone. He helped me with a place to stay the first night, bought me my first meal of Ukrainian food on the Ukrainian side of the border. And then the very next day, I went over to talk to the International Legion, and that individual was able to drop me off there. And that's where my journey started formally with Ukraine and the GUR.
Do you remember your emotions when you crossed the border? Because it's probably one of the most important decisions in your life.
I remember quite a bit of it, that it was just something that I felt just deep down that, again, I felt that it was my duty to come here and fight, and knowing that my skills and my experience and my personality, that I thought that I could do a lot of good and helping the Ukrainians on the battlefield and do everything I could to help protect the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian soldiers, and to try to encourage Russia to turn around and go back to their own country.
So how long was it from the moment you arrived to Ukraine until you find yourself on a battlefield?
That's a good question, and the answer isn't super exciting. I got here in May, and the first time I actually saw combat operations was early August. So that amount of time went to multiple different things that were all mostly administrative. So it started off out on the western part of the country, building a special operations team, doing a little bit of training there because it was multiple different nationalities on that team from various different backgrounds and different levels of combat experience. So we spent a few weeks doing that before we came to Kyiv. Once we came to Kyiv and formally signed contracts with GUR, then did some more training. And the unit that our team was assigned to was just coming off of the battlefield in Severodonetsk. And unfortunately, their commander, a gentleman by the name of Alexei, who had a TV show here in Ukraine, I believe called Recruit, which was his nickname. I believe he did it for the Ministry of Defense. He was just recently killed in action in Severodonetsk. The team that I was joining, we later called ourselves Recruit Team in remembrance of him. So we spent a little bit of time with that. The team needed to do some reorganization. They needed a little bit of time off, and then we did some more training, and then went out to the front lines over in the Mykolaiv area first. So again, it was August. Part of what's interesting with that is Ukraine still was not able to provide very much as far as personal protective equipment. They were able to provide me some body armor, and it was actually very good, new American body armor. And unfortunately, the helmet they were able to provide was multiple sizes too big. So that was something that just doesn't work really at the front line. So probably the first 7 combat engagements with the Russians, I didn't even have a helmet that actually fit. I was just out there with a hat.
So the distance between your expectations and the reality you faced in Ukraine, the reality you were talking about, how big it was?
That was a pretty big difference, because I really thought that I would arrive and within maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks at the most, that I'd be in some kind of fighting position. That was my expectation based on the research I had done. I was actually very surprised that there were so many very different delays. And some delays made sense and some that didn't. And that was my first real experience of understanding, some of the differences, both better and worse, that are different from the culture here and partially the resources here compared to what I'm used to being in the American military. In the American military, we have a lot of resources. And we have a lot of practice working with like logistics, for example. But that also with, we have money to have the resources. And I was able to see early on that Ukraine is really doing the best that they can. It's just a bad situation. And Ukraine just doesn't have the money to have the resources that they really need to fully provide the fighters with what they need. And I see Ukraine constantly begging so many other countries of please send us resources. We don't necessarily need men or fighters, we just need the resources so we could fight our own fight. We just need weapons, ammo, stuff like that. And that's something that I know that President Zelensky has been very adamant about of please just send us weapons and ammo and we will fight this fight ourselves. Just give us the tools to be able to fight this fight.
Can you share defining moments during your lifetime in trenches of Ukraine? Like, what do you recall when you are thinking about it?
Let's see, some of the moments that stand out the most would be, time spent in and around Bakhmut. Most of 2023 was spent either in or around Bakhmut, which was the most intense fighting in all of Ukraine during that time. And that was something very interesting to see how many resources that both Ukraine and Russia was expending to try to take this city. It reminded me a little bit of what I've been told about the Battle of Stalingrad back during World War II. Because the city was not something that had a large military significance. But the fighting started and the headlines started coming out about fighting over Bakhmut. And then Wagner was there also with a lot of resources. And I believe Wagner had promised the Russian government that they would be able to take Bakhmut with proper resources. So it was very interesting to see that and how that compared to like Iraq and Afghanistan, because that kind of fighting just did not exist in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even, Marines before me, older Marines, went and cleared areas like Fallujah, for example. They cleared every single room and building of that very large city. That was before I got there. And that was something that was similar to Bakhmut, but the enemy did not have tanks or artillery or aircraft. They had IEDs and some AKs and stuff like that. And it wasn't like a uniform. So Bakhmut fighting was very, very interesting, being attacked by tanks and aircraft, attack helicopters and fixed wing aircraft, stuff like that was something that was just very new. And it just stood out of just how different the warfare is here compared to what I'd previously experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan.
What adventures and disadventures did you experience while serving in Ukrainian army?
For me, it was really just a huge learning experience of seeing what's different in the culture, what's different in the tactics, and the differences of just the warfare in general. Similar to some stuff I just shared of, the battlefield's completely different here than it is in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't think I've ever heard of trenches out there. It just wasn't a thing. There was just nothing in the air from the enemy, ever. The American and Western and NATO side controlled everything that happened in the air, and we did most of our large operations at nighttime because there was no threat at the night. There was no major thermal capabilities from the enemy forces, and all of us have night vision capabilities. That was something that was very interesting to come here and see that almost nobody has night vision capabilities. The enemy sometimes has thermal capabilities, which means it's very dangerous to do things at night. And that's something that's just very different from the Western doctrine of try to do more things at night because we're able to own the night, whereas here, it's a little bit more of an equal playing field for that. And seeing that so much of the fighting here is reminiscent of World War I, of trench warfare, just with drones and now better artillery. And that there's actual legitimate front lines like in World War II, where you can actually leave the front lines if you want to, come back to an area like Kyiv and do some normal living. It's not 100% normal, but it's something that did not exist in Iraq and Afghanistan, because 100% of Iraq and Afghanistan was a war zone for us, where there was no option to just walk around by yourself to go to the local city of Baghdad or anything, because you might get kidnapped and have your head chopped off, live on camera. And that's something that, it's just different, not necessarily better or worse, but just very, very different. And that's something that took a little while to get used to, and seeing how the Ukrainian military fights, some of it's different, some of it's better, some of it's worse. And some of it's applicable to fighting the Russians, and some of it just would not work fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's something that myself and most other Iraq and Afghanistan veterans have had to learn about, of just how different it is and how some of these different tactics maybe would not work in Iraq or Afghanistan, but they absolutely work here because it's just a different battlefield.
And how would you compare the training you received as a US Marine to the preparation of Ukrainian soldiers you witnessed?
I'd say it's a very big difference. And for example, basic training for a US Marine is approximately 3 months, and that's just to become a Marine. Then after that, you go to whatever school you're assigned to go. So for me, being infantry at the time, I go to the School of Infantry, and that's approximately 2 more months. So that's 5 months of training. From there, I get assigned to a unit, and usually new Marines get assigned to a unit that is recently coming back from a deployment because maybe they had casualties and they need to replenish their numbers, something like that. So then we join this new unit, and then we have about 6 to 7 months, usually minimum, to train with this unit, learn how all the Marines work in that specific unit, all the stuff that they just learned from their recent combat experience, which might be a little bit different than what we were originally trained in our formal schools. So there's times where it might be a year or more before someone that joins the military actually sees combat. So that means that when they see combat, they are extremely well trained at this point. They are experts in their field. They are combat professionals. And for us, then that also makes us usually pretty excited that we get to go and fight. It's not in a way that we're excited to go and shoot people or anything like that. It's just being able to finally do your job, whatever that job is, that you do all this training month after month, all this preparation, all this energy, and then finally you're able to be able to just do what your job is. Here, from my understanding, some Ukrainian volunteers or conscripts get maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or two of training before they're sent out to a trench. And so that right there is just a very big difference, that it might be a month or two compared to, for us, it might be a year or more before actually seeing combat for the first time.
It's maybe because we didn't have a big amount of time in these conditions.
That is absolutely part of it, and I believe also part of it is resources. That in order to do combat training, you need more ammo, you need more weapons. And if the amount of weapons and ammo that you have, if almost all of that needs to go to the front lines because you're defending yourselves, then that means that your training is extremely limited. When I first started my training here in Ukraine, our ammunition was extremely limited. Sometimes having less than 100 rounds of ammunition for 1 day's worth of training, which it's really hard to train with that small amount of resources. And that's something that's just not a problem with the United States. And part of that's just resources and money, of just being able to purchase and have on hand all the weapons and ammo that we have. And that's, all of that context is what I was able to share with the American people of, these people are trying to do this amazing, great thing. They just really need the help of weapons and ammo so that way they could do what they need to do to defend their country, which defends Europe, which also defends America.
How important is the difference in leadership styles in US Army and Ukrainian, if you are talking about commanders?
So one of the big differences that I've seen is with the US military, we are very heavily focused on our non-commissioned officers, which is approximately the rank of corporal and sergeant, which depending on which branch of the military in America would be maybe the 4th or 5th rank up. So it's kind of like your low-level management, those individuals have a huge amount of power. And that's where a lot of our backbone is. The way it works is a commander's intent is understood by the higher commanders. The higher commanders share that commander's intent with the lower leadership, and it's up to the lower leadership to actually formulate the very detailed plan of how they're going to accomplish that commander's intent. What that does is that it encourages and also forces a huge amount of flexibility on the ground in the moment by your leadership that's physically on the ground with their fire teams. And sometimes some of these leaders, it might be a corporal that just has a fire team of 3 or 4 other Marines, for example. Or it might be a sergeant that has a squad of maybe 12 other Marines, for example. So this person is responsible to make very big decisions, which means that the decisions are made very quickly and the flexibility is very, very good. Something that I've noticed over here that sometimes it's more top-down heavy. So that means that some commander that is maybe in a headquarters or a tactical operations center has to actually give orders for some of the things to happen on the front lines. That takes time. Sometimes it takes a long time to grab your radio. If you have a radio, some places at the front lines don't really have radios. They have a lot more radios today than they did 2 years ago, but even 2 years ago, some of the areas, there are no radios. So there is no way to directly communicate quickly with your headquarters that's further behind the front lines. So that means that they're waiting for someone that's in a more safe location in a room, watching stuff, maybe drone footage, stuff like that, to make these decisions, instead of the people in the trenches making the majority of the decisions themselves based on the commander's intent that's been passed down to them.
It's quite a huge difference if you're talking about events on battlefield.
Absolutely. And for me, it's been really cool to see how quick the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian soldiers and Ukraine military has been flexible enough to understand and learn this from the NATO partners, not just America, but other NATO that are here, that are helping out, to see that there's much bigger improvements, like I said, from current tactics than 2 years ago or maybe 2.5 years ago. So I am very impressed to see how much has changed here just in such a short amount of time, because we see how the Russians are doing things, and the Russians are being flexible a little bit also. They have adjusted some of their tactics, but they're not as flexible as the Ukrainian soldiers. So that is something to see the big difference between a Ukrainian soldier and Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers are very stuck in their ways and they do not want to change. The Ukrainians are much more apt to change and to do what it takes to save more Ukrainian and American lives along with other foreigners, and actually take the fight in the right way to the enemy.
We have no other choice, just to learn to be more effective, because
absolutely,
we have a lot of enemies if we are talking about a soldier, much more than we have here in Ukraine.
Sure.
What about the mentality? How does the mentality of US Marine differ from that of Ukrainian soldier on the battlefield?
Well, I believe that your average American warfighter, because they've had usually about a year or so of training before they see combat, has just a stronger foundation when they're in a stressful situation on the battlefield than a lot of the Ukrainian fighters. And for me, that's really mostly just based off of the training. If you've only had a short amount of training to go do such a dangerous and job, it's very easy to make mistakes. And sometimes you learn the hard way of how to fix those mistakes. That's something that we just have a benefit of, that we're not fighting on American soil for Iraq and Afghanistan. We had the terrorist attack of 9/11, but that was a handful of terrorists that were supported by others outside the U.S. and then we went over there and fought them and made sure that those people died in their areas and not on ours. So that's a pretty big difference, and it's an unfortunate difference. But I like that I could see that Ukraine is really doing the best that they can with that situation to provide the best training that they can during such a short amount of time with the limited resources. Because again, I know that they still need more resources and more weapons, more ammo to provide better training during the short amount of time, so that way when their fighters do go to the front lines, they can make better decisions and they can be more lethal when fighting the Russian army.
What distinctions have you observed in how each military cares and support wounded soldiers on the battlefield?
So something that the US and the West in general is known for is logistics. That battles are great, but the way you win a war is with good, successful logistics. If you don't have good, successful logistics, the battles don't really matter. And that's something that we learned a long time ago. And we have reinforced that many, many times. We've been able to see that the Nazi German soldiers were able to do some pretty fantastic stuff and still until they started running out of resources because their logistics was not able to keep up with their combat operations. And that's one of the reasons that they started to fail during World War II. That's something that's here, that it's just different tactics, different mentality, and again, the issue of resources. That we have a lot more resources than the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government does. So far, Ukraine is doing a good job of learning from the West of how to have a huge focus on logistics, so that way when you're doing combat operations, your people at the front lines have all the ammo and resources that they need to be successful every single day.
Is this experience of serving in Ukrainian army changed your perception of what does it mean to serve in conflict zone? Because you mentioned it's quite different from the experience you had before in Iraq and Afghanistan.
It has shared some of that, yes. And part of that is, again, just seeing how important training is. Because for us in the West, it could be fairly normal that if you train for the same job without doing the job for months and months and months and months, it could seem like it's pointless. And there's been plenty of times that myself and other Marines and warfighters have said those words of, why are we doing this training again? We just did this 2 weeks ago. We just did this last month. This is stupid. This is pointless. And I'm able to see just how important it is now. Being able to see that when there's so many similarities at the front lines, that whoever has the better training sometimes is more successful. One example is in Marine Corps boot camp, we spend a week pretending to shoot. 1 week of pulling the trigger on a rifle with no ammo. For a week, we do this. So that way we understand exactly how to properly pull a trigger. Because if you pull the trigger wrong, then you will not hit what you're aiming at. And that's something that I've never heard of from any other nations. I haven't asked all the other nations.
For me.
So there might be other militaries that do that. But I personally have never heard of it. And that's something that at the time, on the first day of it, it made sense. By the third and fourth day, it made no sense to me at all. Why are we doing this for a fourth day? We started to do this more tomorrow. It didn't make any sense. Now I understand why. That for us, that means that from an American warfighter, we can take less ammo into a battle because we're going to hit more of our targets. We're going to be more calm when we're shooting at targets while also being shot at. So that we are more successful and more lethal, which keeps us safer and more of us alive, which also means you need less people on the ground. So less people means less resources are needed, less ammo is needed, and usually you could get away with having less casualties, so less wounded. Whereas over here, with just lack of resources and lack of time to provide more intensive training, means there's going to be more casualties. The soldiers sometimes have to carry more ammo because they pull the trigger a lot before hitting their target. And we see this a lot with the Russians, that there's times where going up to some Russian positions where they're shooting machine guns and stuff like that, and sometimes it's very concerning, and other times it's not, because you could tell that they're not aiming at anything. They're not going to hit their targets. We saw this a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan also, that some of these fighters, being insurgents, had no idea what they're doing, and that they would do a lot of shooting and hit nothing, and it was very easy for one of us to just shoot them with 1 or 2 trigger pulls. And that's something that we see, like I said, with the Russians, that sometimes when they do a lot of shooting, it's not super dangerous if you're close to them, because they're not actually aiming, because they have such bad training, because their training is even less than what your average Ukrainian soldier is getting.
How do you define yourself as a soldier? How good you are?
I'm good at what I'm passionate about. So I like to help and serve others. I've been one of the commanders of the team for quite some time. Sometimes I fulfill the role of a sniper. Sometimes I'm helping more as like medical backup. Sometimes I'm doing some driving stuff. So I think I've learned to be pretty good at plugging myself into the specific jobs needed for that specific mission to maximize the success of that mission, while also being honest when someone wants me to do something else that I know that I'm not very good at, that the person next to me, maybe Ukrainian, maybe American, maybe some other national, might be better at it, that I think I've learned to be pretty good about understanding who does which job best to maximize the success of the team. And that's one thing that's been really cool and fortunate about working with a team that it has so many different backgrounds. The unit that I was with was about half Ukrainian and half foreign. Out of the foreigners, it was mostly Americans. But we had people from probably 12 to 15 other nations all around the world on this team as well, from all different military backgrounds. Some special forces, some regular infantry, some support. We even had a couple civilians on the team that had zero military background until they got to Ukraine. So us working together and understanding our own strengths, limitations, and weaknesses helps us to be very successful and very lethal when we're able to work together. And that's something very important. And that's something that some others fail at, of understanding that it's okay sometimes to say, the guy next to me is better at me at this particular job, so they should be receiving this assignment and not me, that I'd be better off doing something else. And this is why.
And with all your experience, how often do you feel afraid on the battlefield?
The more there are drones and landmines, that is what I don't like anymore. Russian artillery, I have fun with it. Russian tanks, I have fun with it. And that's only because for those, you could hear it coming. And if you could hear it coming after a little bit of experience, you can judge very accurately if it's going to land close to you or if it's going to land far away. If it's going to land far away, then I don't really care. It allows me to be focused on the targets that I'm looking at or the sector that I'm covering, so that way no enemy forces surprise us when we're hiding because of Russian artillery or tanks and something like that. So, but the greatest fear would be drones, because they're dropping grenades, they're dropping little landmines. Now they're starting to drop thermite grenades, which is a little concerning. Generally, no one wants to be set on fire. That's very painful, but that's something that they're doing now. And
if we are talking in general about the fear for the soldier as an emotion, as the feeling, how do you, with all your experience, assume an importance of the fear, and how do you feel it on the battlefield?
I feel it. I think one example would be is when I'm in command of some of the men and the task has changed a little bit because we were given maybe intelligence that has recently updated, but our plan was based on the original intelligence. And now the situation is much more dangerous than what we originally planned for, and we may not be as prepared because the situation has changed from the time that we did our planning and training for that specific mission and arriving on the mission. That's where there's been times of having some amount of fear, knowing that me as one of the commanders am giving orders to some of these men, knowing that I may never see them again alive. And that's definitely a heavy burden to carry for a commander, of knowingly giving an order to someone, knowing that there's a high probability that it's going to get them killed.
You mentioned several times how important is training for the soldiers. And is there any specific techniques maybe or some methods to overcome this fear on the battlefield? Because from my opinion, it's one of the crucial things, because you may get paralyzed on the battlefield and you will be killed just because you can do nothing in the moment you need to do something.
100%, I fully agree that the training is extremely important. And again, that was something that I was able to understand in a whole new way, being on the battlefields here in Ukraine fighting the Russians, than I ever did with any other combat operations or any other high threat operations I've ever done in my life. Just the importance of the training. And part of that is to have people that are professional trainers. So I'm a good example that I have trained some people to do some things, but I am absolutely not a trainer. That is not my profession. I'm able to help out with some stuff, but that's just not my job. And it's something I've never been formally trained on how to be a formal trainer. So in order to fully succeed with training, you need to actually have people that have been formally trained on how to be formal trainers. And that is something that sometimes can be misunderstood. That sometimes people will see someone that has a lot of medical experience, sniper experience, explosive experience, drones, and assume that this person can train a whole bunch of people. And most of the time, that's just not fully accurate. That they might be able to do some amount of training, and they're going to be able to teach some stuff, and sometimes some training is better than no training. But if you're not a formal trainer, if that's not your job, then that's going to really be a hindrance. Just like I'm not a teacher, so I could go to a school and I could talk about a couple things, but I'm not a math teacher, I'm not a science teacher. It would be silly for me to try to teach science class to a bunch of students because that's just not my job. And that's something that I think needs to be taken a little more seriously in some of the training that's going on here, of having people that are actual formal trainers and then providing the resources that they need, for example, weapons and ammo and stuff like that, to do proper training.
From your experience, can you remember this kind of story maybe, or situation that made you realize your personal resilience as a soldier?
Let's see, I would have to say that just increasing my flexibility and my willingness to be flexible in stressful situations is something that I learned a lot about myself here in Ukraine. Because in Iraq and Afghanistan, both when I was in Iraq as a civilian, as a security contractor, and when I was there as a US Marine with the military, we all kind of do things the same exact way. That one of the reasons that we do so much training is so that way we don't have to always do a lot of talking in combat situations. We all know what to do. Here, even if there's been some training, again, like I said, the unit I was with, half of it's Ukrainian, half of it's foreign. And now the foreigners, so many different nationalities and backgrounds, a lot of people want to do things a lot of different ways. So some Westerners have a hard time with that. Some are not willing to be flexible with that, and for them, they've made, in my opinion, the correct decision, and they've gone home because they cannot handle the new requirements of the front lines here. And some of it's for very good reasons. Some of the differences here are, there's good and bad differences, and then some of it's just different in general. So that's something for me. I've learned how to just be more flexible, and for me, that's given me a lot of personal growth of being flexible and pursuing more connection and understanding when someone is doing something that maybe I disagree with or don't fully understand why they want to do this mission a certain way, because for me, it might seem illogical of really pursuing understanding that maybe their way might be better, or maybe we just need to continue the conversation a little bit more and see that there might be a good compromise that keeps us all alive a little bit more than their plan or my original plan, just because it's a different battlefield here.
How do you perceive such kind of situation, terrible situation from my point of view, when you see that someone on the battlefield needs help and you are not able to help him?
For me, being in a position of a commander, sometimes you have to be willing to constantly look at the bigger picture. And even if that bigger picture is not much bigger, but understanding that sometimes you might have a friendly soldier out there that's yelling and screaming that needs help. And sometimes, yes, you can go out there, risk yourself, and grab them and pull them back to friendly lines to help save their life. And sometimes it's honestly not worth it, knowing that if we send a couple people out there, that the rest of us also might get injured or killed in the process. And that's something that a good commander, in my opinion, is able to make those decisions, of understanding that sometimes it's unfortunate that you have to give the order of that person is on their own for a little while. And maybe if the situation changes in the next few minutes, then maybe we can go and get that person. Or that person, we just might be forced to just hear them scream until they die.
Is it weights on you after the fights, and how do you handle with it? Because from my point of view, not the soldier at all, it's quite hard to perceive it. Maybe first time, and I don't know. And then you get used.
In my opinion, it's not really something that your average person really gets used to. It's just learning and growing. And that's something that just as a leader and as a commander, that you need to be willing to grow constantly and to improve yourself constantly, not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally and spiritually. I believe it was one of the Confederate generals during the United States Civil War in the 1860s said something to the effect of, to be a good soldier, you have to love the army. To be a good leader or commander, you have to be willing to send what you love to die. And that concept of loving something and to be passionate about something, and then if you want to be a leader of it and a commander of it, being willing to give orders, sometimes on a regular basis, to have some of that killed off, literally and completely, that's something that some people just can't do. There's very good leaders out there, and there's very bad leaders out there. And for me, I'm still learning how to be a better leader and a better commander. And I believe that your good leaders and commanders hopefully never stop learning of how to just be better at that.
My next question might be tough, and I will understand if you will not answer it. But do you remember, can you share the situation on the battlefield during this war or other war that you were experiencing during your service that is still weight on you, that you made a wrong decision?
For a wrong decision, no, not really. Because it's something that, again, with the training that we have in the US military and having a strong emphasis of leadership at the lower levels, that part of that is you have to make decisions. And that sometimes the worst decision is making no decision at all. So that's something that I believe I've done a very good job at when situation changes in a moment or we take an unexpected casualty of making very quick decisions and then being flexible with those decisions. And sometimes there are times that I look back and realize that maybe if I had thought of something else or if I knew some other information just a little bit sooner, then I would have made a different decision and that might have had a better outcome. But for me, I don't think there's a whole lot of value of looking at maybe wrong decisions, because sometimes it's not really a wrong decision, but maybe there could have been a better decision. But in that moment, based on what the leader knew at that time, it was the best decision moment. And sometimes it's the best decision because it was a decision instead of saying nothing at all.
Wow, great mentality. Is for me just amazing, and it's very useful information for me as a journalist that I received from you. Is there a story about your fallen friend, or maybe some kind of events that you are carry with you as a source of strength and motivation?
There is one. A gentleman by the name of Dan Swift. He is a U.S. Navy SEAL in the U.S. military, and he arrived here before I did. So he was, fighting in Severodonetsk before I even got here. He's actually one of the black bands that I wear on my wrist here, along with a Ukrainian Canadian here. Whereas this man, he was fighting in Bakhmut. Originally, we were kind of on the same team for a while. He went off to one of the sister teams. And when he was injured there, he was still talking and walking. And what made that profound is he had a bullet in his brain. And this man, partially because I think he was a Navy SEAL, and this was the first Navy SEAL I've interacted with that was actively wounded on the battlefield, and I was actually able to, hear just part of the story of what was going on with him. My fellow brothers that were there when this man was wounded and helped him get off the battlefield is, he was walking and talking with a little bit of assistance for walking, and he was talking softly but making sense. He was saying stuff that was applicable to the moment, but he did this with a bullet in his brain. And that is something, seeing that resilience from this man is something that has encouraged me. And my only regret for that is that I just wasn't there that day to offer my part of the support, and I'm happy and proud that some of my other buddies and brothers in arms.
All of your experience, what the war mean for you? When you're thinking about the war, what is for you?
I see this, that there's a much larger picture here, and it's something that I believe that most are not recognizing. And that's one reason why I was so adamant to talk to so many people back in the United States, and one reason why I drove over 32,000 kilometers to talk to as many people as possible, so that way they can understand that this isn't just fighting at the front lines. This isn't just trying to protect a city called Kyiv. It's not just trying to fight back to get a city of Bakhmut that basically doesn't exist anymore. But what happens here affects the world on the geopolitical level. We know that China is closely monitoring what happens here because we know that China wants to take Taiwan. And America has made it very clear that Taiwan has the full support of the United States government and the United States military. So if, we're saying something similar here. So if America cannot provide actual security in Ukraine and Ukraine loses, then that gives a lot of encouragement for China to take Taiwan, for example. And this is some of the stuff that I was able to talk about with others back in the US, that this is an extremely complex situation that will definitely shape what Europe looks like and possibly the rest of the world in the years to come, depending on the outcome of the battles that are happening here today.
How do you define heroism at war?
I would have to say when it involves courage. And courage is not the absence of fear, but it is actively overcoming a known fear. If you're doing something and you have no fear, then there's nothing really special about it, because you're just doing something and there's no fear. But when you have fear down to your deepest parts of your being and your mind and your emotions, choosing very difficultly, usually, the courage to overcome that fear and do whatever is necessary to keep yourself alive, especially at the battlefield, for me, that is where a lot of heroic acts of valor really come from, is when the individual is able to choose that courage and really suppress a very real and legitimate fear that they have.
Do you assume yourself as a hero?
I see myself as someone that just is doing something that he's very passionate about. And I'm not going to tell people what to call that. I'm just here to do a job and to help out where I can and to help and serve as many people as possible in the best way that I can, whether it's with pulling the trigger or by just sharing my experiences with my voice.
What was your biggest sacrifice that you made for the war in Ukraine?
I would have to say that it'd be leaving my country. Coming to a foreign country that a lot of Ukrainians speak some amount of English because it's taught in schools here, but it's not the common language here. So to come to a foreign country as a foreign volunteer, to join an international legion that is largely foreigners, that is brand new, so especially at the beginning, it's highly disorganized. Each time I try to do anything that your normal civilian would, of go into a grocery store, most of the things are not in English. So for me, that's very uncomfortable for me. And it's something that, I'm fortunate that, it was one of the things I was able to enjoy very much back when I was in my country, to be able to go wherever I wanted to. And almost everyone speaks my native language. And that's something that I'd say would be my biggest sacrifice, is temporarily leaving that behind.
What is your sense of identity and purpose beyond the battlefield? How do you feel yourself?
I see my identity as someone that works pretty hard to follow Christ as a Christian, as an American Marine, especially a scout sniper, as someone that is a profession in his job, which means that he's also not good at many other things, but can use skills and experiences previously learned both as a Christian and as a warfighter, specifically as a scout sniper, to hopefully make good decisions in other aspects of life, and to use all of those experience combined and the totality of those to try to connect with and help as many people as I can, whether they're foreigners or fellow citizens or even Russian POWs.
How do you see the future of this war today? What might happen next?
I'd say that there's going to be a lot of similar fighting going on in the near future, of the same type of trench warfare as both sides sometimes are fighting to get more resources. There's parts of the front line that the Russians need the same resources that the Ukrainians do, that they have almost the same ammo shortages that the Ukrainians do. So there's not a whole lot of shooting. So I believe that's going to continue until there's an opportunity that makes sense for peace negotiations between all the nations that are involved. Because I see the only other options is Ukraine has to conquer Russia, or Russia has to conquer Ukraine. So other than those other options, which obviously we don't want Russia conquering Ukraine, and Ukraine, as far as I know, does not intend to conquer Russia. That the only other way is for peaceful negotiations that include Russia turning around and going back to their homeland.
Yeah, it will be a tough goal, but I hope we can achieve it. And what are your hopes for Ukraine's future in general?
I hope that Ukraine can really experience the sovereignty and safety and security that my country gets to experience. Obviously, this entire generation and everyone that's alive today is experiencing some pretty horrific things and a very unique experience fighting for their own country, whether they're young kids or old people that, this might be their third war, fourth war, interacting with Nazis or Soviet fighters, stuff like that. That for me, it'd be really cool for many years to pass of peace in a country like Ukraine, so that way some of their newer, younger citizens can start to experience what it's like to be in a country where younger people don't know what an air raid siren sounds like, which again would most likely turn them into maybe voters that might vote for less military or something like that, which is something that we have going on in America. But that's only possible because the peace and security that's provided there. And for me, that's something that I would really like the people of just this region of the world to be able to experience what that's like, to go decades without knowing artillery, missiles, anti-aircraft fire, air defense, stuff like that going on.
And what things need to be done from the point of international community to ensure that this is the last war in our and your lifetime?
A very heavy involvement and a strong partnership. I'd say that Japan and Germany are very good examples. That back in the 30s and 40s, they were our enemies. We dropped atomic weapons on Japan. Once they surrendered, we immediately started dumping money and resources and partnership into their country to rebuild their country, and instead of conquering, we turned them into an ally. However, we also left military bases there. Same thing with Germany. Once they surrendered, we put a lot of money and resources into helping rebuild their country while leaving American bases that are still active there today, because Germany has been known to start multiple world wars. So, we have a strong partnership with them, but understanding that what they've done in the past will not be allowed to ever happen again. And we're using our military force to do that, and we're doing it in the guise of friendship, not as occupiers, not as tyrants, but seeing them as equals. We can work together to produce peace, and peace is generally good for business. It's good for prosperity, good for economies.
How do you see your life after this war ends? What would you do?
I want to do as much as I can, especially with my experiences and sharing my experiences, to help and serve as many people as possible. At the moment, I've been able to do that, in my opinion, on very small scales, very small levels. I'm very fortunate and proud that I was able to partner with the American Coalition for Ukraine and interact with members of Congress at our Capitol to help out with an aid package worth $60 billion. And I know that I will never fully see how much that helped Ukraine and how much that helped this part of the world. But knowing that I was just a small part of that, working with other awesome people within this coalition that are also part of that, that's something that I'm very proud of, and I want to continue doing stuff like that. And I would love to be able to do it at a much bigger scale, to be able to help more people and help more nations that just need help from what is just a stronger and more secure nation, both financially and economically, like the United States.
And what would be your message for the people who are considering now join Ukraine? What you would say for them?
That Ukraine is definitely worth fighting for, and that it's definitely its own very unique experience that will probably be very different than any experience that you've ever had in the past. But this is something that the victory here will be a much larger victory than just Ukraine alone, that it'll be a victory for Europe. It'll be a victory for areas that seem to be disconnected, like I spoke about with Taiwan. There's even countries like South Korea, for example, that are very interested in what's happening here because their neighbor is North Korea. One of North Korea's closest partners is Russia. So if Russia is successful in combat operations, then that can definitely encourage Russia to help North Korea more, which then hurts South Korea, which then looks at re-engaging that war, which is a war that's actually not even technically over yet. And that's something that the US, again, has made it very clear that we will fully support South Korea. And we really don't want war to break out there on the Korean Peninsula ever again. So everything that's happening here matters. And so every bit of support that happens here matters a lot to save possibly millions of lives in our very near future. Not just people that want to come here and fight, but I got to interact with some people in Poland about a month and a half ago. Most of them are Ukrainians that they just build camouflage netting, just like the netting that's next to us right now. And that's what they do to help Ukraine. And they've produced hundreds of these nets for the Ukrainian front lines, and they're all volunteers. They do fundraising for all this stuff. So it's just an example that you don't even have to come to Ukraine to do stuff that matters for Ukraine. In America, you also don't need to come to Ukraine to help. You can just call up your congressman and tell them that you want more support going to Ukraine, so that way American troops do not end up in a war directly with Russia. And that's something that I was able to share with a lot, that if you have money to donate, that's great. I run fundraisers to try to just survive and have food, and a lot of other people need a lot of stuff. But if you don't have that capability, you could pick up the phone, you could send emails, send letters to your representatives in the House of Congress in the United States, and just tell them that you want more support for Ukraine, so that way America doesn't end up in a world war with Russia. So there's so many things that could be done, and I believe every single person worldwide has something that they could do to offer Ukraine, and it's something that will definitely, in my opinion, probably save millions of lives in the near future.
Matthew, after all the things I discovered about you during our conversation, and after all the things I learned from you during our conversation, I would like to say that you are 100% hero, at least for me, and I'm pretty sure for our audience. Thank you very much, and I hope the God and the faith are on your side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.